The Housing Assistance Council is a national nonprofit that supports affordable housing efforts throughout rural America. Since 1971, HAC has provided below-market financing for affordable housing and community development, technical assistance and training, research and information, and policy formulation to enable solutions for rural communities. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Permanent Supportive Housing. According to HUD's 2020 Annual Homeless Assessment Report, 7% of the homeless population were in rural areas. In today's webinar, information will be provided on challenges and opportunities with rural supportive housing models, supportive housing strategies, and financial resources for acquisition, rehabilitation, and new construction. Thank you to USDA Rural Development for sponsoring today's event. And it's now my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Katie Simmons is a supportive housing consultant and CFO of Beau Simone Consulting. Prior to starting Beau Simone Consulting with her business partner, Zoe LeBeau, Katie served 2 years as the program manager for Denver's Road Home. This is the city's homeless plan, where she oversaw emergency shelter and street outreach efforts, coordinated 9 Project Homeless Connect events, and managed community engagement with various neighborhoods. Katie then consulted with Governor Hickenlooper's Office of Community Partnerships, leading a statewide effort to help communities assess the need of their most vulnerable and at-risk populations around the state of Colorado. This work led to development of strategies for youth, families, and veterans experiencing homelessness as part of the National 100,000 Homes campaign, and ultimately was a stepping stone for the work that Katie does now. Also joining us today is Bridget Course. Bridget has been working in affordable housing for nearly 20 years and with Beau Simone Consulting since 2015, focusing on supportive housing, including tribal HUD-VASH. Bridget is committed to affordable housing as a way to build equity, stability, and health for all, and has significant direct service and program management experience. From 2014 to 2001, Bridget worked for Southwest Colorado housing nonprofit, Housing Solutions for Southwest, working with federal and state-funded housing programs including COC, VASH, housing counseling, housing choice vouchers, CSBG, CDBG, ESG, and affordable housing development that resulted in permanent supportive housing development called Aspero Apartments. Now I'd like to welcome today's speakers.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having us. My name is Katie, and Bridget and I are very excited to share the next hour or so with you talking about permanent supportive housing in rural communities. Our objectives for today are to give you all an overview of permanent supportive housing and the Housing First model. We'll talk just a little bit about harm reduction, trauma-informed care, and trauma-informed design. We will touch on challenges as well as opportunities with rural supportive housing projects, and we'll talk both about single site and scattered site PSH and best practices in scattered site permanent supportive housing. We will give a very high level overview of the development process, talk a bit about strategies for development and funding, and then we will end today's webinar with 2 different case studies from 2 different rural communities, highlighting projects that we have worked on and that have been really successful. One using low-income housing tax credits and the other one not using that funding source. So with that, I am excited to turn it over to Bridget.
What is permanent supportive housing? It's nice to be here with everybody today. I'm not 100% sure who my audience members are. I'm sure you're from a wide variety of backgrounds and disciplines. Maybe some of you are leaders in your community. What is it though, right? What is permanent supportive housing? It's a way to end homelessness. It's a way to end the cycle of homelessness by doing something that is very logical and rational, providing affordable subsidized housing and adding in supportive services that help people to stay stable in their home. It's cost effective, meaning it saves money to the communities it's built in. It is outcome driven, meaning our #1 goal is to keep people in housing through those supportive services. And it's a more humane way to end homelessness for families who are struggling with multiple issues, right? So addiction, mental health needs, people who have disabilities that are lifelong that result in cycling in and out of homelessness. So when we talk about permanent supportive housing, we also talk about it being permanent. We used to use a model called transitional housing, and many of us still do use it across the country, but that's just 2 years. That's a 2-year bridge. We also use rapid rehousing, which is also typically around 2 years. We're talking more permanent housing, so it's housing that's not time limited. People can live there as long as they need to. And it's affordable, so residents pay no more than 30% of their income. We very intentionally build and develop these projects to have housing subsidies attached to them so that people with low incomes pay no more than 30% of their income in rent. It's independent as possible. So what does that mean? That's, people just do not, we don't have people there, they're not in rehab, they're not in a nursing home, they're not in a care facility or a nursing home. It's an independent as possible living situation where people sign their own lease and follow the guidelines for that lease. So who do we house in permanent supportive housing? So depending on where you are or what type of programs you have, you might be focusing on a very specific population, or you might have a very broad population living in your building. But it's families and individuals who are homeless, including those who are living on the streets or in shelters. Sometimes it's people who are living in overcrowded conditions or couch surfing, being discharged from prison or other care systems. And also people who are living in places not meant for human habitation. For example, cars, garages, abandoned buildings. Back when I did a lot of work in the field, I would go take photographs of a camper that somebody was living out here in Southwest Colorado in the middle of a field to document their homelessness. So it's a wide variety of backgrounds that people come from when they end up in supportive housing. The other thing to think about when we're looking at people who are going to live in supportive housing is these families and individuals often have a substance use disorder and or a mental health need requiring supportive services to stay stably housed. They have cycled in and out of homelessness for many years because of these disabilities, burned their bridges, right? I worked at a housing agency for many years, and it's a small town, it's a rural community, and we housed people many times over, and they burned their bridges with landlords. They burned their bridges with some of our other programs. Because they couldn't make it work. There wasn't enough support involved to help them stay stable in housing. So it's their service programs that provide help with their behaviors associated with chemical dependency and behaviors associated with their mental health needs. People who frequently utilize emergency services, so a lot of the people we house in PSH are people who have cycled in and out of detox, in and out of jail because they are asleep outdoors and the police identify them with a need. So we really focus on those folks who use a lot of community resources. What are the benefits of supportive housing? Affordable housing providers benefit from having services available to the residents. So I would argue even in non-permanent supportive housing, having the presence of service providers on site results in a higher level of tenant retention. It results in people being good neighbors and good tenants. Human service providers like it, right? Because back in the days when I did case management, I couldn't really work any type of plan with anybody unless they had stable, safe, affordable housing. City, state, county governments like it because you're addressing an issue that they're facing and they're being asked to address. And so they really do like supportive housing for this reason. Katie?
Great. Thank you so much, Bridget, for that overview. And also thank you so much to everybody who's chatting into the chat box where you are from. It's wonderful to see so many folks here from California, Utah, all the way to Arkansas and Ohio. So keep those introductions coming. We'd love to know who's joining us today. So just a little bit about the different types of supportive housing. Typically, you might hear the term either single site supportive housing or scattered site. And just to distinguish between those two, single site supportive housing is typically located in an apartment style building. And typically speaking, single site will house individuals and families, but sometimes this model is best for individuals who are experiencing homelessness, and it will provide supportive services on site. Scattered site is not one individual apartment building. It typically allows individuals to lease private market housing units where they're using a rental subsidy, such as a tenant-based Section 8 voucher. And then the supportive services are delivered to the individual units by a care manager or offered at an off-site location. So just wanted to talk a little bit about these two different types. We know that there are positive outcomes for both. Both single site and scattered site PSH prevent a return to homelessness and increase the overall quality of life for the program participants. And again, single site usually has a specific focus audience. So it might be a single site for veterans. It might be a single site building for youth. It might be a single site building for people who are, coming out of the Department of Corrections with high behavioral health needs. And so usually there are specialized programs with services on site that really are intended to help the population that is living there. Scattered site is implemented within affordable housing developments with more dispersed programming, right? So this results in numerous external factors affecting outcomes for program participants. And again, research from the Homelessness Policy Research Institute has shown that single site PSH is beneficial for homeless individuals with substance abuse challenges, as well as those living with HIV and AIDS. And scattered site PSH has typically been shown to more positively serve families experiencing homelessness. Again, this isn't to say that families can't live in single site or that individuals can't live in scattered site. It's just that some of the research does show that oftentimes individuals do better in a single site PSH. We know that there are cost savings, again, in both of these types of housing. So for example, and these data points are taken within about the last 5 to 7 years. A chronically homeless person accounts for $35,578 per year in community resources. So again, as Bridget mentioned, cycling through detox, jail, emergency shelters, emergency rooms, hospital rooms. Costs on average are reduced by 49.5% when they are placed in supportive housing. So almost cutting this cost in half. Supportive housing on average costs about $12,800, which again represents a 50% reduction in public expenditures for unhoused households and up to 79% in some communities when looking at chronically homeless individuals. This next slide is going to show a couple of different communities. Again, most of these, 5 of these are urban centers, but we did want to point out rural Maine that was also studied as a community by the Corporation for Supportive Housing. And as you can see, the yellow or light orange line represents the costs per community pre-supportive housing for somebody who is, again, living on the streets or in shelters and cycling through those emergency services. And so in rural Maine, you see that an individual was costing taxpayers almost $40,000, probably about $38,000 per year. Once they were housed, that cost went down to about $22,000. So we're seeing at least a $15,000 savings per year per individual. And again, we really do know that this is, the smart thing to do, both financially as well as from a social justice perspective, in terms of being able to give people homes and give people the supportive services that they need in order to really not just survive, but also thrive in those homes. And just again, to make this clear, that supportive housing is not any of these things, right? Supportive housing is not shelter, it's not a group home, it's not transitional housing, it's not a residential care facility, and it's not a treatment center. So again, as Bridget mentioned, people live in apartments. Typically, they have their own bedroom, their own bathroom, their own kitchen, their own living space. They hold a lease, they pay rent, and they really are trying to live as independently as possible. Bridget, I will turn it back over to you.
So what is the supportive services approach? That is like the kind of secret power of these programs, is these additional supportive services on site. And they are always centered around the population served. So if you're targeting a population of single adults, for example, who have maybe substance use disorders, you're going to have a very different set of services than if you have all 3-bedroom apartments targeting families. So they're centered around the population served. We have veterans programs out there. We have homeless youth programs for youth who are transitioning from 18 to 24. So the services are also flexible in responding to the needs of the resident. We do services that adapt to what the person's needs are, knowing every single person inherently knows what their own goals are for the future and what they need to do to move forward in life. They're voluntary, so we don't use services as a carrot to make somebody, to give somebody housing. If you participate in services, you can have housing. If you're sober, you can have housing. If you go to therapy, you can have housing. It's voluntary. We want the best for people. We want them to participate in services, but the way that we go about engaging with people in housing and permanent supportive housing is very much a voluntary approach on the part of the person living there. Independent focuses on independent living, independence in housing, managing your household, managing your budget, managing your shopping and your housekeeping, being a good neighbor, being part of a community. All of those things are focused on as part of the service approach. Again, tenant-centered services always offer meaningful choices for people. They take into consideration the input from the tenants living in the building. So you always want to get advisement through the development process, actually from the very beginning when you're designing your concept, to the architectural design, to the program design, and then when you go back to evaluate your programs, really getting that feedback from the people that live there. Services meet the needs of tenancy, meaning the services are really targeted at helping people stay housed, all of those skills that are needed to remain in housing and be a good tenant. They're culturally relevant and appropriate services, so we're always respecting the population that lives there, and we're understanding that for many people, you know, their culture is medicine. That's that sense of belonging that we talk about in PSH. So we have to recognize that. Examples of services on site. So counseling comes to mind, right? Just that really kind of very basic level counseling about what somebody's struggling with, what their needs are. Health and mental health services. So we always try to make sure there's some sort of behavioral health case management in the building, because they can be the link to all of those behavioral health services that might not be located on site. Alcohol and substance use services, independent living skills such as housekeeping and cooking assistance, money management assistance, connecting people with a rep when they do struggle with managing their money. Community building activities. I would argue this is the most important thing for people who have so long not felt like they belong to a part of a community. Examples of staff. So front desk staff in our single site projects, especially, they're like the first line of welcoming and entrance to the building, and they're also the gatekeepers, right? And they also provide a lot of support to the tenants around setting boundaries with their guests, and also knowing who's coming and going, making sure that people are okay and checking in with them. There's a program manager, case managers, mentors, peer specialists. Peer specialists are especially important in these projects lately. They have a lot of credibility with the people that live there because they've been there and done that. So they're a really important part of the team. Clinical therapist, property manager, maintenance technician, often overlooked, but often the first person who sees that there is indeed a problem on site or in somebody's apartment because they're going to fix something. Katie, this is you.
Wonderful. And thank you as well for folks who have responded to our poll. Please continue to fill in those answers if you haven't yet. Stephanie posted a poll. We're curious as to whether your organization, your community currently has single site permanent supportive housing, scattered site permanent supportive housing, or neither. So please take a minute if you haven't already to fill out that poll. So just kind of establishing a common language when we talk about housing first and the housing first model, what does that mean? Housing first really is an approach that offers permanent, affordable housing as quickly as possible for individuals and families who are experiencing homelessness. Then once we have folks stably housed, we can start to provide supportive services and connections to community-based supports that people need to keep their housing. So when we think about this 5 level here over on the right, really meeting people's physiological, biological needs is the first step. So somebody really needs access to air, water, food, shelter, sleep, clothing, right, before anything else can be taken care of. So when we think about housing as a foundation, we want to make sure that we are providing shelter, we are providing that housing for people, and then the safety, right, becomes very important about people feeling secure, feeling safe once they feel that they have a stable place to start to address some of their other needs. Then they can start kind of working upwards towards love and belonging, self-esteem, and finally self-actualization. I think we're all, myself, I'll speak for myself, still working towards self-actualization. I don't know if I'll ever get there, but this really does at least give us a common language from which we are able to work when we talk about the housing first approach. And again, not needing people to be housing ready, right? So if we haven't figured everything out around our mental illness or our substance use disorder, that's okay. We believe that housing is a right, it's a basic human need, and that no one should be denied housing for any period of time because they didn't, for example, meet predetermined clinical goals, right? Or they decided not to partake in medication, or they decided not to participate in services. As Bridget mentioned, housing should never be used to coerce people into services, right? It's about client choice. It's about giving people the opportunity, motivating them, right? And being really creative around the services that we do offer so that people want to choose to be engaged in those services. And again, housing can be interconnected with services, and we know that they are interconnected, but there should be separate criteria for operation and certainly separate criteria for evaluation. Just a little bit about harm reduction. Again, what is harm reduction? We are looking at ways in which we can reduce the adverse health, social, and economic consequences of the use of legal and illegal drugs without necessarily reducing drug consumption, right? So what we're striving to do here is reduce the harm that is caused to somebody or to others because of their use. And harm reduction really does benefit people who use drugs. It benefits their families. It benefits the community. I like to think about harm reduction as a common sense approach, right? So when I get into my car, I put on my seatbelt, right? Because I know that if I get into an accident, that seatbelt is going to hopefully save my life. It's hopefully going to cause me a lot less harm than if I get into an accident and I wasn't wearing my seatbelt. Same with sunscreen, for example. If I want to avoid getting skin cancer, right, I'm going to put on sunscreen so that I can hopefully reduce the likelihood or reduce the harm that I am causing to my body. And so harm reduction in supportive housing, there are some incredibly skilled, trained professionals, social workers, care managers, folks who do this every day and use really great techniques to incorporate strength-based programming, strength-based services. So really, how can we concentrate on what the individual is bringing to the situation and how can we capitalize upon their strengths? We want to use motivational interviewing. That's a whole other training if folks are interested. There's certainly some great opportunities to take motivational interviewing courses. It's really a skilled way of interacting with somebody, right? Asking really open-ended questions, thinking about reflecting and synthesizing back to them what you've heard, but really engaging in a person to try to indicate, try to get at what is going to motivate them to change some behaviors. So it's a really great technique in terms of how we can use harm reduction. Again, we don't want to try to catch people doing things unless it's an immediate safety issue, right? We really want to, especially with care management, have a therapeutic, trusting relationship, and we don't want to do anything that's going to eliminate that trust. And again, at the end of the day, we're not putting together services plans for folks because we think they need to get into treatment, right, so that they can have a chance at reuniting with family. We really have to keep asking ourselves, are we allowing the tenants to make their own choices? And then we really also need to understand the impact of trauma and its relationship, right, with harmful behaviors that some people might be displaying. So just a little bit about trauma. And again, this could be its own day-long webinar around trauma and trauma-informed care, but we just want to touch on it because we do know that most people who live in permanent supportive housing have experienced some type of trauma. And so we just want to have anybody, whether it's a maintenance person, a landlord, a care manager, anybody who's going to be interacting with someone who lives in supportive housing, to at least have a basic understanding of what trauma looks like, so that we can be more comfortable with responding to it. So in this picture, the brain is literally, right, being lit up as though it's on fire. This is when you know, your prefrontal cortex, which is, you know, cognitively telling you everything that, you know, you should do, and it helps you with timing, it helps you with critical thinking, it helps you, you know, make sense of right and wrong. When trauma happens and someone goes into their fight or flight or freeze or fawn mode, the 4 Fs as we like to call them, this is when, you know, your amygdala just shoots into action, and basically that is your survival response, right? So your brain is shutting down all non-essential tasks. It's impeding rational thinking, right? It's not able to, a person is not able to engage in a dialogue or a conversation. All they're thinking about in that moment is, how do I survive? How do I keep myself safe? So, you know, we do know that trauma is an intense stress that overwhelms our biological, physiological, and social coping capacities. And we just really want to make sure that folks understand how to respond to that appropriately. So again, you know, this comes from SAMHSA, what a trauma-informed organization is, what it looks like. And so I like to think about the 4 R's, right? That an organization or a program or a system that is trauma-informed really realizes the widespread impact of trauma, and also understands that there are potential paths to recovery. So I am a big believer in that. I believe that every person on this webinar, right, has experienced some form of trauma. We all have. It's a universal experience among everyone. And, you know, whether those are small T's or big T's or a combination of both, I do believe that there are ways to heal from trauma. And sometimes it takes people a lot longer. Sometimes people need a lot more help from and with and by professionals. But we do understand that there are potential paths for recovery. And we really do believe that supportive housing is one of those places in which we begin to allow people to really heal from past trauma. So the second R is that, you know, we are able as staff to really recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in our clients, families, staff, and others who are involved in the system. So within the system. So again, we can literally almost see if somebody's trauma has been triggered, how their brain is lighting up. If we can start to recognize it and really understand what's happening, then next we can start to respond to it fully. So fully integrating knowledge about trauma into our policies, our procedures, and our practices. And finally, the 4th R is to really resist and seek to actively resist re-traumatizing an individual. So we will do this in a lot of different ways, starting actually with the way in which we design a building. So I will turn that over to Bridget to discuss a little bit more.
So what is trauma-informed design? When Katie talks about trauma, right, the idea of trauma-informed design comes out of this world of trauma-informed care, where we're involving from the very beginning, service providers, people who are going to live in the buildings. We're involving them in the planning and development process of the buildings, giving their input to what that building looks like. We all know that the living environment that we are in, or that we're living in, or that we're working in is very important to our peace of mind, to our sense of stability, safety, and belonging. So trauma-informed design really does believe that housing needs to promote dignity, healing, and well-being. So we're trying to build a space of healing for people when they come into permanent supportive housing. We also know that even though trauma is very damaging, it can be healing, and recovery is always possible, and we want to maximize that in our projects. Through a holistic, culturally relevant, and trauma-informed approach to design, we contribute to prevention of further trauma. Always prioritizing the physical and mental health and well-being of individual residents, but also the whole community in these buildings. So examples of trauma-informed design when we work on these projects as a single site is a welcome desk and lobby area. So we want people to feel as though they have a concierge at the front desk, somebody that they can go to when they need laundry soap, or if they have a guest that they don't want let in the building, or just to talk in the middle of the night when they're wide awake and can't sleep. Open stairwells, so lots of light, maximizing a feeling of safety if somebody's walking through those stairwells. Clear lines of sight throughout the building, through the common spaces. Art throughout the building, especially art that's culturally relevant, that connects people with their culture. Glass windows in offices, so that we don't have even though the office door is closed, people can see if some of the case managers or service providers are available to meet with them and reach out to them. Warmer colors, so colors that feel really warm to a person and safe. Earth tones quite often. Bringing in elements from the outside, so we like to develop projects that have indoor-outdoor space that's shared. Rural homelessness. Homelessness may be far and wide, spread out, and harder to see. So I live in Southwest Colorado. It's spread out. It doesn't look like it does in downtown Denver, right? It's very different here. And so it's harder to see, and it's harder to count, and it's harder to report on. It's different in rural communities than urban communities, where we have a lot of national forest here in Southwest Colorado. People camp. People camp in warmer months. People are a little bit mobile during the colder months. There's always fire and safety concerns in this land. They also have limited access to transportation and to services because they may be choosing to live quite a distance out of the city. So in these cases, sometimes we use a scattered site model to provide those services and housing. Best practices in scattered sites. So we, here in Southwest Colorado, where I was, we provided what's called rapid rehousing. Many of you probably provide that. That is not permanent supportive housing. It is time limited. But without options for PSH, sometimes we would put people in rapid rehousing who needed a lot of support. Another example of scattered site permanent supportive housing is the Tribal HUD VASH, or the VASH program, where the VA provides a case manager and the individual has a permanent supportive housing voucher and rents a unit in the community. So the best practices in scattered site are landlords are busy, so provide that support to the tenant by helping them get their paperwork in, making sure they're paying their rent monthly, being really adaptive to the landlord, case managers really being on top of what the client needs to stay stable in housing. Show the landlord it's a relationship they want to have for a long time, right? So build those relationships with your local landlords. Sometimes we've been able to offer larger security deposits to landlords to show that a good faith effort to, if there's damage done to the unit or if they're owed money. Work with clients to teach them housing survival skills, so really help them with those skills around staying housed. Teamwork in scattered site model is critical. Between the social services, case manager, and the landlord, it's crucial that communication, regular meetings, conference calls, delineation of duties, who's responsible for what, and I also talked about incentives for landlords as well. So here's somebody needs to mute themselves. Thanks. Sample agenda for team meetings. This is just a sample agenda. Again, I think these slides will be sent out just with the key points you talk about in those team meetings. And also, inevitably, somebody's going to struggle in housing. This is an idea of what a tenant retention planning process could be, what it could look like. And that's a really important thing to keep people housed stably. Tenant retention. Did I skip one? No. Tenant retention strategies, build skills for residents, create solutions to ongoing problems, ensure we're doing the best we can to keep folks housed. I know for me, in my past housing work, whenever somebody was evicted or somebody had to move out, it was traumatic for me in a lot of ways, and I would always reflect back on what we could have done from the beginning to try to have that go better. And I would learn a little bit every time. And sometimes it was unavoidable, but it's a really good process to go to keep people housed. The other thing I'll say, mutual rescission of leases is the most important thing to look at if you possibly can. Eviction, it should be avoided at all costs. I mean, it does set people up for a lifetime of housing instability. I'm going to have Katie talk a minute about the development process.
Great. Thank you, Bridget. So again, won't go in too much detail about this, as I know this could be a lengthy webinar itself, but the development process, just to say, this work does take a long time. Tasks are going to be very interdependent. Your timing is going to be critical. You're going to have a lot of different players involved. And it's a very complex process, right? So in thinking about developing, a single site project is obviously going to be, years, 2 to 4 years out in the making. Scattered site, is still going to take a long time around establishing those relationships, but you're certainly not developing or building a new building. But if you are thinking about developing a single site permanent supportive housing community in your community, just understanding that there really are 3 separate budgets and 3 separate parties involved. That's going to be your development budget, your project budget. Secondly, you're going to have an operations budget, and then you're going to have a separate services budget. And again, all these have different funding sources, from different types of capital to operational subsidies to services that might come from local municipalities all the way up to federal resources. So funding is very complicated, and it really does just kind of take at least, I would say, 2 to 4 years if you're thinking about kind of starting new. 5 phases of development, really this conceptual sort of who do you want to serve, how do you want to do it, your scope and size of the project, the location. Feasibility is when you're going to run all of your sort of due diligence, right? You're going to do your environmental studies. You're going to do market analysis. You're going to do needs assessments. You're really going to try to understand, is the data that we have in our community informing the need, and is the site that we're looking at developing on feasible? Deal making is really when you start, putting in all those applications, right, for funding, whether it's, ARPA dollars, the American Rescue Plan Act dollars that you're applying for from, say, a state government or local, all the way to tax credits, and, putting in applications to your local housing authority for those project-based vouchers or tenant-based vouchers in the case of scattered site. That really takes quite a while. The construction period, we used to say would take 12 to 14 months. Now, post-COVID, right? With both labor and supply chain issues, we're seeing that be 14 upwards to 20, 24 months. And then operations is once your building is open and you're really going to be able to start implementing a lot of the best practices under that housing first model, using harm reduction, using trauma-informed care, and really having your property management team and your services team work together. So just a little bit about the development and financing of supportive housing. Again, lots of different financing options. Low-income housing tax credits, may not work as well in rural communities, but Bridget is going to highlight here in just a minute a rural project that she worked on that was using LIHTC to actually do the construction. We know that American Rescue Plan Act is now available, may not be available for that much longer, but it's still a resource that a lot of communities are able to go after. Federal Home Loan Bank, the Affordable Housing Program that they have is also a great resource. There are housing trust fund dollars, both federal and in most cases state level. There is home and CDBG, community development block grant opportunities. There's always private foundations, as well as your local continuum of care. And with the continuum of care, I would just say, reaching out to your local COC is probably going to be the best way to get started with really understanding what resources are available. I'm guessing that if you're in a rural community, you're most likely part of what's called the balance of state. And these continuums function very differently from state to state. So probably a great opportunity to just kind of start to get in touch with your local COC representative to really understand what your local landscape looks like. Bridget?
So this is a case study of Aspero Apartments. It is located in my hometown here in Durango, Colorado. It is a project I'm proud to say that I, was very involved in from the very beginning. And it took a long time, like Katie said, development takes a long time. It took a long time to build the political will within our community. It took time to get the land donated from the city. Took time to get together with developers and funding sources and to build agency capacity so that we could make this project a reality. Sparrow Apartments opened in October of 2021. It's 41 bedroom apartments. It was very clear from our point in time study in Southwest Colorado that most of the the entirety of the unsheltered population were single adults or couples. So we knew we needed 1 bedrooms. It was a $10.5 million development budget that was awarded pre-COVID, and we built through COVID. And so as a result, we did have some difficulties, having to reduce our budget. It was a 9% LIHTC deal with the gap funding from the state of Colorado Division of Housing. As I said, the land was donated by the city of Durango. We also have 40 project-based housing vouchers that are attached to the units. Services are provided on site from Access Health System, Southwest Center for Independence, and Housing Solutions for the Southwest. The development partner with Housing Solutions for the Southwest, we are a small nonprofit. We were not able to take on the financial risk involved in developing a project like this. We partnered with Blue Line Development, and that's a partnership that's still in place until the building reaches its 15-year mark. The architect, Shopworks Architecture, they are the folks who have really taken the lead on this trauma-informed design work that I talked about. And we had many wonderful supporters, but specifically capacity building funders who gave us grants as nonprofit staff. Enterprise community partners and Colorado Health Foundation allowed for us to spend all of those hours as agency leaders to make sure this project became a reality. So that's the common space. It is one of the most beautiful locations. It has an amazing view, and you can see how beautiful it is here in Southwest Colorado. Elements of trauma-informed design, an open stairwell, very simple kitchens, very simple shelving, very simple to clean floors. There's a fenced-in patio living area. It's going well. You know, the first year of these projects are always really hard. As I said, this project is only happening really because there's so many people dedicated to it still. I really saw the project through its opening and then moved on to other things, but it was something I was very proud to be a part of. And it housed 40 chronically homeless adults in Southwest Colorado. Katie?
Great. Thank you, Bridget. And so we'll give one more example of a non-low-income housing tax credit project that was done in rural Montana. And then we do want to have time here at the end for questions. So please feel free to start putting those into the chat box. But the Morningstar Apartments is another project we wanted to highlight. This is owned by the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes in Ronan, Montana. And this was done in 2020, in the later part of 2020, using CARES Act funds. So before ARPA actually came about, the first year of COVID relief, when the CARES Act was made available, the tribe, the CSKT tribe, decided that they were going to purchase a motel. And they really felt like that would be a good, relatively quick and not easy, but a quick way to at least go about transforming some existing units into what they needed for their community. So they basically took this old motel, they rehabbed it in honestly about 5 months. It was very quick. It was when we thought that CARES Act funding was going to run up at the end of 2020. And so they did a lot of different things to rush to get engineers and architects and contractors and the right people in. It was about a week before the end of 2020 when the federal government came out and said, oh, we're actually going to extend this for a whole other year. But by that point, 98% of the work had been done. But the tribe was able to pull this off. It's a really incredible example. It is 14 units now of supportive housing for individuals. There is also one caretaker unit on site. So somebody does live there on site and is there overnight. And then there was one unit that was converted into a staff office. And this is really a small space for doing lease up, for doing telehealth, for doing one-on-one meetings. The focus population is for people who are homeless and or people who are leaving incarceration who would have otherwise been homeless, released in homelessness, and who had a very high risk of COVID. And again, the services on site are actually provided by the Tribal Defender's Office. So the Tribal Public Defender's Office said, we know that we have a population in need, and that's really who we want to focus on here. They partner with behavioral health, they partner with employment, and then they also partner with the Salish and Kootenai Housing Authority, who has provided 14 project-based vouchers so that, again, these units are subsidized. And again, this is housing that is not time limited. People can stay there for as long as they want. They're using, obviously trauma-informed care, housing first, and really all the services are very grounded and rooted in culture and tradition from the CSKT tribe on the Flathead Reservation. Just a little bit about the project team. They do use an outside property management company. So the housing authority said they really didn't want to do property management. They wanted to provide the vouchers, but they were not able to do the property management. So we worked with an outside company. It just gives you a little bit of a sense of what it looked like upper left when they first started doing rehab, and then turning each of these rooms into, kind of a studio, very small kitchenette, but individual restroom. And then there is a fence, a gate around the building to really try to make it as secure as possible and allow for residents to be able to go in through a secure, controlled access gate to be able to get into the complex. And there's our staff, as well as Dylan, the therapy dog, who is quite an asset around the community, I will say. The development budget on this one was $1.8 million. And so again, that included the acquisition of the building, rehab, all the appraisals, inspections, environmentals, architect, engineering, IT, furnishing and supplies, and the housing and supportive housing consultants that the tribe hired. And I will turn it back over to Bridget for a couple of final thoughts here.
So final thoughts, low-income housing tax credits may not work in smaller rural communities, so it's something to keep in mind. Minimum of 30 units are typically needed for the project to pencil, meaning you can break even running it. I will say though, Durango is a community of 20,000 people, and our community next door to us, Cortez, Colorado, is even much smaller than Durango, and they are building a project with LIHTC funding. Think about modular manufactured homes, duplexes, fourplexes, or scattered sites. So this works a lot when we work in very rural areas. Those fourplexes can be really helpful. So the case manager can visit 4 people at once. Start thinking about the need and how to build your organization's capacity to come together around a common goal. So really building that political will, finding funders. I mean, I know for me, the project never would have come together if I didn't have funders that believed in my capacity and invested in my capacity when I worked at the nonprofit doing this work. So start thinking about that as well. So we have time for questions, just a few minutes, and I don't know that I see anything in the chat as of yet.
We also want to leave you all with some resources. So we have put, our own website, Bo Simone Consulting, on here. Lots of resources on supportive housing 101, some videos, some articles, ShopWorks architecture, and the trauma-informed design research that they have done. Would love for you to check that out. A little bit more about housing solutions for the Southwest and the Sparrow. There is some information here from both Rural Health as well as the HUD Exchange, thinking about homeless assistance and strategies in rural communities. So we got a couple of questions. Thank you, Jonathan and Curtis. First of all, from Jonathan, can you talk a little bit about the challenges, if any, in funding and delivering services in a scattered site versus single site context?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about that a little bit. I've done both. And I think the single site makes it a lot easier because you see people in the lobby, you see them getting their mail. The case manager and service providers' offices are typically right there on site. So that makes it a lot easier to access the people that you're trying to engage with. So there's one challenge. And then with the scattered site, people's phones don't work, or they don't answer their door, or it's a whole variety of issues. But I will say, especially for people, there's a lot of people who do well in a scattered site model because they struggle with that living with close proximity to neighbors. And so I could see that as definitely a positive. And also, we do want people to eventually, if they are able to, rent the apartment of their choice. And so having that support and having that case management out in the community is really helpful.
Great. And then Curtis has a question about NIMBYism. So did we encounter any NIMBYism, not in my backyard, issues in either of the projects, and how did we overcome it?
Kate, it's really funny because I think Aspero was an exception because we often do encounter NIMBYism in the communities we work in. But in Colorado, where I am, there's such an issue with people literally camping in our national forests and on our county and city land that I think most people in our community, there was very little opposition to Aspero because people saw the benefit of housing people over having them be camping. So,
yeah,
but we do.
I think in rural communities, it's oftentimes maybe a little easier just because people are really, I feel I've seen this, more willing to come together around a common goal. They oftentimes know, right? Their brother or their uncle or their son or their daughter is one of these people who is experiencing housing instability or homelessness and may very well end up in supportive housing. And so that is not often the case in urban communities, I will say. And we try to really strategize, depending on the neighborhood, depending on the timing of how to go about doing that. It is different, and I will say it looks different in every community. We do have a resource on our website if folks are interested in checking it out. Under our resources page, we have put together a neighborhood engagement guide. Now, granted, it was put together through the lens of some folks in Denver, Colorado working together, so a little bit more urban focused, but I think there's some really good tips for neighborhood and community engagement anywhere you go. But I will say, you know, as a consultant and not as a developer, developers might have a very different answer to how to go about working with neighbors. But I believe that we have to do that because the neighbors are going to be there for the long run. And the more that we can work on integrating, right, the new residents into an existing neighborhood, I feel like it will benefit our residents in the long run. So instead of fighting against it, really trying to figure out, you know, we don't want to be invaders. We want to be good neighbors. How can we do that in terms of community integration with the existing neighborhood? And then finally, Michelle has a question about, do you have any suggestions on how to manage the properties once construction is complete? Where does the funding come from? So, Michelle, I would say, you know, in terms of an ongoing operating subsidy, that is definitely where those vouchers come in. We really wouldn't be able to do this without operating subsidy because we know that the people who will be living here are so very low income that the amount of rent they're able to pay is not going to be sufficient. So we have to have an operating subsidy, typically in the form of that housing choice voucher, Section 8 voucher, to continue helping with operations. The funding for management, and that's what you were talking about. So an operations budget is put together to ensure that all of your expenses are taken care of. And that's going to include, right, either a management fee or a per door fee, as well as your maintenance team. And it's going to also probably need to include an operating reserve because we do know that in a lot of these units, there's going to be more wear and tear, right, that there might be in a traditional affordable housing unit. So with the help of, you know, typically some of the operating subsidy will pay for up to fair market rent in whatever county or community that you're in. And we want to make sure that there is a little bit of extra, you know, cash flow, if you will, just to make sure that you are able to take care of any of those unexpected expenses as they do come in. And then services, I will just say, is a totally different budget, which is going to need to be raised, you know, by looking at what services might be billed to Medicaid, what you might be able to raise through your local continuum of care. If this is a tax credit project, is there a percentage of the development fee that might be able to go into a services reserve budget to fund services for the long run, and a plethora of other funding sources that your local community hopefully might be able to come up with. Thank you so much for the questions. So I believe our time is up, and we just again wanted to leave you all with our contact information. We are so happy that you joined us today. Please feel free to follow up, as Stephanie has mentioned, on HAC's website. You'll be able to find a PDF of the PowerPoint and a list of the links. And we are also happy to have any follow-up conversation with anybody if you'd like to contact us via email. Really appreciate the questions and the comments, and for all of you joining us today, and really hoping and wishing you all the best of luck when it comes to hopefully bringing supportive housing to your community.
And I want to thank both of you, Katie and Bridget, for this wonderful presentation. Thank you so very much. We'll have it posted for everybody who attended, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good day, everyone.
Bye.